Chapter 23 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 23. 1769 to 1821. Personality of Napoleon. There is no personage in history who has been so much written about as Napoleon. The books on his life would fill a large library. Yet upon one point only is there practical unanimity of opinion: that as a soldier the world has never seen his equal. A century has not been long enough to arrive at a conclusion as to the full meaning of his life; nor has it produced any man comparable to him in force of will, energy, or in sheer power of intellect. It has been said that Napoleon himself never understood England, but it is certain that the British mind has never been able to fully appreciate the Emperor. Many have studied him with profit and insight, but never entirely free from the old insular prejudice. In France, the cult of the Napoleonic legend still survives, but no longer in an imperialistic sense. The nation today is profoundly pacific, but it is not unmindful of the great figures of its historic past. This centennial year, France has united in honoring the greatness, nay, the grandeur, of Napoleon. A century hence it may be possible to see in a truer perspective the influence of Napoleon upon Europe and the world. Italy and Germany really owe to him their unification. The struggles of peoples for their independence that marked the course of the last century received from him their original impulse, and in the Europe of today his influence is clearly to be seen. In the calm light of a century of experience there can now be little room for serious hesitation as to the place to be assigned him in the march of political and social progress. "No single mind," says Mr. H.A.L. Fisher, "is more powerfully stamped upon the institutions of contemporary France, for by his reaction against its excesses he saved all that was precious in the philosophy of the Revolution." Napoleon had none of the illusions of a democratic statesman like Burke that "whenever the people have a feeling, they are commonly in the right." In his opinion, an intelligent but illiterate population like that of France, demoralized by revolutionary anarchy, and without experience with democratic institutions, was unfit for political liberty. What the nation needed was social equality, guaranteed by a strong and intelligent government. The old monarchy had been weak because the vital forces of the state had been paralyzed by social privilege. No matter how autocratic the administration of Napoleon might be, it still provided an open career to talent of every kind. In the social structure of France as it was left by Napoleon, equality was the rule. Compared with the England of Pitt and Fox, the France of Napoleon was essentially democratic. "It is for this system of equality," said the exile to Amira, "that your oligarchy hates me so much." With respect to political liberty, Napoleon's attitude was entirely different. The memory of the wild orgy of talk and legislation in the revolutionary assemblies was still fresh in his mind, and the trying scenes of the 19th Brumaire had never been forgotten. He felt that a popular assembly, so far from being a help to the ruler, was a source of perplexity and embarrassment. If he had not yielded during the 100 Days to what he believed to be the growing popular demand for a legislative form of government, he might have preserved his throne. The higher education of France received at his hands the impetus which won the admiration of Matthew Arnold. During the recent war, some 5,000,000 men in the American and British armies received some form of liberal or technical instruction. The idea was suggested by Napoleon at St. Helena, where he said that it was one of his plans that every regiment should have its school for instruction in science, the humanities, and mechanics. Brilliant as was his military renown, Napoleon always realized that he lacked the greatest of all props to political power, legitimacy, and that only continued success could assure the stability of his throne. He therefore turned to a new force, until then hardly realized by public men in Europe, and became the first journalist of his time. He possessed in the highest degree the talent of placing his victories in the most favorable light, while excluding all uncomfortable matter, and his bulletins and other communications published in the Moniteur constantly commended the principal actor to the admiration and applause of the world. In the monuments of the capital and in the museums of painting and sculpture the memory of his military triumphs was also preserved, and will live for all time as an inspiration for a great martial people. During his youth, and until he became Consul, Napoleon was not at all attractive in person, and could hardly be called well groomed. He was a little over 5 feet 6, English measure, and was well proportioned. At the age of 40 he became stout, and looked even smaller than he really was. His hair was dark brown, and until after his return from Egypt he wore it long in the Revolutionary style. His forehead was high, his eyes a brilliant blue gray, his nose straight and well shaped, his mouth rather large, with a so-called Cupidon upper lip, his chin round and dimpled. During the early years of the Empire, before his face became too full, his features were very handsome, with a clear cameo-like profile. In early life his health was uniformly good, but later he began to show signs of lessened activity, due partly to a greater love of ease and partly to failing physical strength. He had inherited a sound and tough body, capable of standing great fatigue, and with remarkable nervous strength. He was very moderate so far as the table went, although he ate too fast, and he never drank any wine except a little Chambertin diluted with water. Without being entirely chaste, he was never in any sense a libertine. During his campaigns, until the different army corps had nearly reached the positions assigned them, Napoleon remained at general headquarters. Then he proceeded rapidly to the front in his traveling carriage. In the presence of the enemy he always accompanied his troops on horseback. At his quarters in the field he received the reports of his marshals, and personally directed all the corps movements. In the intervals he attended to the internal administration of France, and replied to the reports which were sent him from Paris by his ministers, who wrote him every day. He thus governed his empire at the same time that he directed his army. He had such a remarkable constitution that he could sleep for an hour, be awakened to receive a report and give an order, and immediately fall asleep again, without his repose or his health suffering. 6 hours of sleep was sufficient for him, whether he took it consecutively or at different intervals during the 24 hours. The days which preceded a great battle he was constantly on horseback, to reconnoitre the force and the position of the enemy, study the field of battle, and visit the bivouacs of his soldiers. Even during the night he rode along the entire front to further assure himself of the strength of the enemy by the number of his camp fires, and he wore out several horses in a day. The day of battle he took a position at a central point where he could see everything which took place. He was surrounded by his aides de camp, whom he dispatched to carry his orders to all points. A short distance behind him were always stationed 4 squadrons of the cavalry of the guard. The marshals were advised of his position so that their reports could easily reach him. If his presence became necessary at any point, he immediately galloped there, followed by his escort. Napoleon was a very hardy but also a very careless rider. He sat hunched up in the saddle, holding the reins loosely in his right hand, with his left arm pendant by his side. Sometimes he went at a walk or a trot, but more often at full gallop, without paying the slightest attention to the route. Before adopting the legendary gray redingote, Napoleon protected himself against the cold of the bivouac with a light blue cloak, the manteau de Marengo, which he always kept, and which covered his coffin at St. Helena, and under which he now sleeps in the Invalides. Upon the field of battle the tents of the Emperor were erected in the middle of a square of the Old Guard. There were always 3 principal tents, one for the Emperor, one for Berthier, the Chief of Staff, and a third for the officers of the household. The personal tent of the Emperor was in 2 parts. The first, called the office, was furnished with a small writing table, an armchair of red morocco, for the Emperor, and 2 stools for the secretary and the aide de camp on duty. The table and the chairs were all folding. The second part was used as a bedroom. Here was erected the little folding iron campaign bed, with straps enclosed with dark green curtains. The foot rug of the traveling coach served for a descente de lit, and the nécessaire de voyage completed the furnishing. At night the secretary and the aide de camp slept on cushions in the office. The tents, the bed, and the furniture could all be folded and rolled up and packed on the backs of mules for transportation. The little iron camp bed was about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. It was the bed used by Napoleon at St. Helena, upon which he died, and is now at Paris. Minerval states that Napoleon never dictated except while walking. He sometimes began while seated, but at the first phrase he arose and began to walk around the room, continuing this promenade the entire time he was dictating. Words to express his thoughts came to him without effort, and although sometimes incorrect, they always conveyed his idea clearly. In his addresses to the Senate, in his proclamations, in his diplomatic notes, the style was always well considered and appropriate to the subject. Napoleon rarely wrote himself. He found it too fatiguing, as his hand could not keep pace with the rapidity of his conception. He never took a pen in his hand except occasionally when he was alone, and there was no one within call to act as his amanuensis. His writing was an assemblage of characters without connection and almost unreadable. Half the letters of the words were wanting. His spelling was never correct, although he could always find any errors in the writing of other persons. This was due to the fact that his mind moved so rapidly that he would not interrupt the flow of his thoughts to take time to write correctly. Napoleon had naturally a very active mind. Always and in all things he went straight to the point. In a discussion, he always found at once the conclusive argument. Upon the field of battle he discovered the decisive manoeuvre. For him, to think, to decide, to act, was a single indivisible act, so rapidly executed that between the thought and the act there was not a moment lost. If, says Thiers, he had chosen one of the civil careers, where one can only succeed by persuading others in winning them to your point of view, perhaps he would have learned to moderate, to control his passionate disposition; but thrown into the career of arms, and endowed with the supreme faculty of divining at a glance what must be done to win, he reached with one bound the domination of Italy, with a second the government of France, with a third the supremacy of Europe. What marvel, then, that this nature which God had made so quick, which victory had made still more prompt, should be brusque, impetuous, domineering, absolute in its will? Everything had cooperated, nature and events, to make of this mortal the most absolute, the most impetuous of men. It was not, however, until towards the end of his career that Napoleon gave way entirely to this spirit of domination. Then, seeing nations submit and sovereigns bow before him, he no longer takes account either of men or of nature, and dares all, undertakes all. When he had ceased to command, he became gentle, simple, charitable, with that charity of a great mind which understands human nature, appreciates its weaknesses, and pardons them, because he knows that they are unavoidable. At St. Helena, divested of all prestige, having over his companions in misfortune only the ascendancy of a great mind and character, Napoleon continued to dominate them absolutely. He so strongly attached them to himself by his unaltering kindness, that, after fearing him for the greater part of their lives, they loved him for the rest. Towards his family he always showed the greatest kindness and generosity, and pardoned over and over again their faults and their failures. For the Empress Josephine, even after her divorce, he also displayed a profound tenderness, although his first passionate love for her had long been cooled by her many acts of infidelity. In his testament he speaks in the kindest terms of his "dear wife, Marie Louise," and states that at the last moment he has for her only the tenderest sentiments, although he knew full well that she was living in open concubinage with Neipperg. No career in history has been so dramatic, few so pathetic, as that of Napoleon. It covers just 19 years. It began in 1796 with the campaign of Italy; it ended with Waterloo in 1815. Looking back when all was over, from the lonely rock where fate had chained him, he said, "I may have had many plans, but I was never free to carry out any of them. It was all very well for me to hold the helm, but however strong was the hand that grasped it, the waves were much stronger still. I have never been really my master. I have always been controlled by circumstances." He always realized that his hold upon power was insecure. It was this feeling that constantly urged him on to deeds that brought ruin in their train. "Your sovereigns born on the throne," he said to Metternich, "may be beaten 20 times and go back to their capitals. I cannot, because I am an upstart soldier. My domination will not outlive the day when I cease to be strong, and to be feared because I am strong." As a soldier, Napoleon's personal courage was above reproach. Of this he gave many admirable examples, from the bridge of Arcole in the first campaign in Italy, to his last battle at Waterloo. It was, however, his moral courage that won his campaigns; the characteristic boldness in design and execution, the willingness to risk much to win much, that, coupled with intellect, made him the master of Europe. No man in history has equalled Napoleon in force of intellect and character, and perhaps no one has ever been more favored by opportunity. Yet, despite his great administrative work, Napoleon was not a true statesman. He had the power to create, but not the talent to mold into permanent form. Had he been content to rule a France limited by her "natural boundaries" of the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees, he might have founded a dynasty which would be the most powerful in Europe to day. But, as Frederick puts it, he sought to keep too much, and ended by keeping nothing. Success in war, in the opinion of Napoleon himself, is largely a question of moral, in other words, of opinion or reputation, and he adds, "The art is to preserve the reputation when one has secured it." This view is also endorsed by the greatest soldier of our own day, Maréchal Foch, who insists upon it frequently in his writings. Every great commander, having established a reputation for boldness, enterprise, and skill, wins under circumstances where, without this moral help, he might fail. This fact is often illustrated in Napoleon's career, particularly at the opening of the Wagram campaign of 1809, and during the campaign of France in 1814, where his reputation of doing sudden, unexpected, and dangerous things puzzled and dismayed his antagonists. No great soldier has ever achieved success without imagination; the ability to see the result of a far reaching operation at its very beginning, and Napoleon possessed this trait in a very marked degree. Says Bourrienne, "Although he was perhaps the most positive man who ever lived, yet I have known no one who allowed himself to be carried away more easily by the charms of imagination. Under many circumstances, to wish and to believe were one and the same thing." But this will to see nothing impossible, this unlimited reliance on results, which was at first one of the causes of his success, ended by becoming fatal. There was developed gradually the feeling that failure was for him impossible, and that his own views and acts were infallibly right. When he ceased to tolerate dissent, discussion fell into disuse, and every one obeyed his orders, even though he knew that the Emperor was not sustained by facts. This was most marked during the unfortunate campaign of 1813, the poorest he ever conducted. As Marmont said of him, "He no longer believed in truth when it conflicted with his passions, his interests, or his moods." That Napoleon was ambitious cannot be gainsaid, ambitious not only for the present, but for the future. Bourrienne quotes him as saying, "For me the immortality of the soul is the impression one leaves on the memory of man. This thought leads to great things. It were better not to have lived than to leave behind no traces of one's existence." It is the thought expressed in Scott's immortal lines, "One crowded hour of glorious life is worth an age without a name." On another occasion he denied that he had ambition; then he corrected himself, and said that it was "so natural to him, so innate, so attached to his being, that it was like the blood that flowed in his veins, or the air he breathed." So long as Napoleon commanded small armies, and retained his abnormal nervous vigor, his desire to keep everything in his own hands was one of the chief causes of his success. But when his armies grew larger, and his physical force began to decline, his lack of a competent general staff led to failure. It was impossible for him to attend personally to details so extensive, and he had trained no subordinates to do it for him. Like many men of very positive character, Napoleon wanted around him only active, laborious, and obedient mediocrity. His nominal chief of staff, Berthier, was only a very efficient and docile head clerk. It was the same with his marshals. Only a few, like Masséna, Soult, and Davout, were capable of independent command. His other generals were exceptional lieutenants only. Never was a man so born for leadership as Napoleon. This trait was displayed even during his school days at Brienne. When he took command of the army of Italy in 1796, he found a group of general officers all older and more experienced than himself, and yet he at once imposed his will upon them. There was no attempt to evade an order during the campaign. This power over men extended both to his generals and to his troops. "The qualities which go to make up the typical warrior," says Dodge, "were possessed by Napoleon in greater measure than in any other man of modern days, and so superior was he to his antagonists that he could not fail to win under anything like equal conditions." No commander in history ever conceived such gigantic military problems, reduced their execution to such simplicity, and carried them through with such boldness and ability. His power to gauge a situation was most remarkable. Says Odenlieben, in speaking of the campaign in Saxony, "One looked through his glass, and he had seized the picture of a whole army with incredible speed. He thus judged from some height whole corps of 50 or 60,000 men, according to space and position." When to this power of clear vision there be added the innate boldness of the man, and his capacity for hard, unceasing work, you have such a combination of qualities as the world has rarely seen. At St. Helena, Napoleon said, "Genius consists in carrying out things despite obstacles, and meanwhile in finding few or no impossibilities." The result of all this clearness, boldness, and application was, as he himself puts it, that "all plans of the 14 campaigns of Napoleon were in strict accord with the true principles of war. His wars were bold, but methodical." To this greatest of commanders leadership is naturally the sovereign spell. "An army," he lays down, "is nothing save what it is by its head. The general is the head, is the all, of an army. It was not the Roman legions that conquered Gaul, but Cæsar. It was not the Carthaginian army at the gates of Rome that made the Republic tremble, but Hannibal." In all his wonderful career there is no scene more thrilling than that in which by word and action he subdued and won over the first of the troops sent to oppose him on his return from Elba. Alone in front of his chasseurs, Napoleon steps forward. "Soldiers of the Fifth, I am your Emperor. Acknowledge me." Then as he flings back his coat, "If there is amongst you a soldier who would slay his Emperor, here I am." France was won. The whole army yielded to the spell. Theatrical it may have been, but who except this mighty player would have had the daring, the skill, the profound knowledge of the heart to play that desperate role? For this man knew human nature as thoroughly as Shakespeare, and could play upon it with the same sure touch. It is futile, as Rose well says, to attempt to sum up Napoleon in any one category. Attempts have been made to do so, but with indifferent success. There is only one man in history of faculties sufficiently varied and forceful to challenge comparison with Napoleon. The figure of Julius Cæsar dominates the Roman world, as that of the great Corsican overshadows the age of the French Revolution. Take them all in all, as soldiers, statesmen, lawgivers, Cæsar and Napoleon are the two greatest characters in history. End of Chapter 23. End of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. Narrated by Celine Major.